Good evening. I seem to have gotten myself into another predicament. But until I find my way out, I'd like to share with you another one of my favorite artifacts from the Poe Museum's collection on tonight's Curator's Crypt. Welcome to the Poe Museum's Curator's Crypt. Good evening and welcome to this week's installment of the Curator's Crypt. This time I'm going to talk to you about one of my favorite little almanacs from the collection. And you know what an almanac is. You get it at the beginning of the year. It's supposed to tell you when the first frost will be, the cycles of the moon, when to plant your crops. But this one is all about death, destruction, despair, and tragedy. It's called the Tragic Almanac for 1843. It would have come out towards the end of 1842. And it's full of lurid descriptions of all the most awful tragedies throughout the country. There's steamship explosions, murders, suicides, and it might just give us a clue to the sources behind some of Poe's stories. And one great example I like to show you is the story of John C. Colt, the brother of Samuel Colt, the firearms manufacturer. And he met a printer named Samuel Adams, not the Samuel Adams, a different Samuel Adams. But for some reason, up in New York City, John Colt and Samuel Adams got into a fight. So naturally, John reached for his hatchet, and he killed Samuel. Then he realized he had a problem. He had a big mess to clean up, and he had a body to dispose of. So he had a great plan. He would just pack it up in a crate full of salt to slow the decomposition, and then mail it to an imaginary address in New Orleans. So that's what he did. It even went on board the ship. But people started missing Samuel. In fact, people had remembered hearing a fight in John's office and hearing somebody fall to the floor. So suspicions were aroused. Eventually they found the ship, located the crate, and yeah, they did ask the sailors aboard the ship if they noticed any unusual odor about it, and they said, well, of course we thought that was just rat poison. So they opened the crate, and of course there is Samuel Adams. Now this idea of crating up a body, taking it aboard a ship, many critics think it inspired Poe's story, The Oblong Box, about a man who packs up his wife and carries her aboard ship with him. But that's just one of the many tragedies contained in the Tragic Almanac. I want to talk to you about the cover story, the murder of Mary Rogers. So let's backtrack to 1838, and Mary Rogers had been hired at Anderson's Cigar Emporium. This was a time when not a lot of women were working in public. Not a lot of them were clerks in stores, but John Anderson had this idea that if he hired a beautiful girl to sell cigars, that business would boom. And he was right. Half the men in New York started going to Anderson's Cigar Emporium, including some of the great writers of the day like James Fenimore Cooper, maybe even Edgar Allan Poe. And there's descriptions of gentlemen who would go to the Cigar Emporium, spend the day smoking cigars just for the opportunity to exchange flirtatious glances with Mary Rogers. Meanwhile, her mother, who'd been widowed, was running a boarding house, and one of the tenants was Alfred Crumlin. He gives his profession as gentleman. He was quite smitten, so many other men were too. but he was kind of the nerdy guy, the sensitive fellow. She was interested in Daniel Payne, the bad boy, a hot-tempered, heavy-drinking cork cutter, a guy who cuts corks. Her mother didn't like Daniel Payne, so that only helped with things. And Alfred said he saw Daniel and Mary in the boarding house in a compromising position, and he was just so offended that he left the boarding house immediately. But he did tell Mary that if she ever got in trouble, she could contact him. So amidst all this, Mary left the cigar store. She actually disappeared. This is a strange thing. She disappeared, left a note that many interpret as a suicide note, and the newspapers were carrying notices of this. People were worried about her, and then all of a sudden she just shows back up again. So now we move forward to 1841. Similar situation. Mary is going to travel across town to visit some relatives. Daniel walks her to the omnibus, and she takes off, and he plans on catching her later that day. He's going to wait for her, pick her up, and walk her back home. But it rained, and he went to a bar instead. His alibi checks out, apparently. He was at the bar drinking. He wasn't there to pick her up. She didn't come back home that night. Alfred was terrified. He thought something must have happened to her. He organized a search across New York City to find her. Daniel went back to the boarding house, comforted Mary's mother, and then Alfred went all the way to Hoboken, New Jersey, across the Hudson River. It was a place where New Yorkers could escape the heat and the grime of the city for a pleasant day in the sunshine along the shore. And just about the time that Alfred arrived, two boys were out boating, and they came upon a corpse floating in the water. The face was so badly decomposed they couldn't tell who it was. Alfred showed up, and he recognized her by the hair on her hands. And then they pulled the body ashore. It sat in the hot sun for hours until the coroner could get there and examine the body. They found the body had been dragged. It had scratch marks along the back. She'd been strangled. And the cord around her throat was tied with a very specialized knot that a sailor would have used. So now the hunt was on for the killer. The constables interviewed everybody they could. Nobody confessed. They were out of ideas. They did track down Mary's last known whereabouts to Hoboken, to a roadhouse there, run by the widow Frederica Loss and her sons. And she was seen in the company of a man with a suntan. That's all they really know. And her sons said that they heard some commotion outside, a gang of hoodlums. So it's suspected that this wild, unruly gang of hoodlums are the ones who took Mary and assaulted and murdered her and then dumped her in the river. Not too long after that, they found some of her clothing in a thicket. And they said this is where the crime must have taken place. Daniel Payne was devastated. He felt guilt over what had happened. He traveled to Hoboken, to the spot where he believed that Mary had been murdered, and he overdosed on laudanum. His suicide note asked for God's forgiveness for his misspent life. So they never did find the gang of hoodlums. And if you look on the cover of the Tragic Almanac, there's the gang of hoodlums. Hoodlums back then wore top hats, apparently. They're very well dressed hoodlums. But Poe wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Edgar Allan Poe had already invented the detective story with Murders in the Rue Morgue in April of 1841, revolutionizing fiction. He'd created a new kind of character that solved impossible crimes using acute observation, analytical reasoning. He was the forerunner by about 46 years to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. In fact, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle said there was nothing really original left to do after Poe. He blazed the way for all else to follow. So by 1841, 1842, Poe is looking for an idea for a sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And he'd been reading all the newspaper accounts of the Mary Rogers case. So he said, well, I'm going to write about that case. In fact, I'm going to solve that case. The authorities couldn't do it. They're overlooking the obvious. She wasn't killed by a gang of hoodlums. The scratch marks on her back indicate the body had been dragged. A gang would have picked her up and carried her to the river and dumped her in there. We're looking for one person. He also believed that when rewards were offered for the identity of the killer, if a gang had done it, somebody in the gang would have turned in the other members of the gang to get the reward money. So he just wasn't buying it. And he thought, well, who killed her? It must be the gentleman with the suntan. And he thought, well, who could have been this person? Probably a naval officer. Somebody who would have known how to tie that sailor's knot on the cord around Mary Rogers' neck. So he pieced together his explanation for who could have killed her. He titled it The Mystery of Marie Roget. He changed the setting to Paris so that he could use his fictional character Auguste Dupin to solve the mystery. But he made no doubt about it that he had solved the mystery. If you read the story, he introduces it by saying this is very similar to that case in New York. In his letters, when he's trying to sell the story, he even says, this is not just going to be an entertaining story, this is going to revolutionize crime fighting. This is going to turn criminology in its head. It's going to change the way we investigate all similar murders like this in the future. But the story was very long, 20,000 words. Too much for one issue of the magazine. They had to spread it out over the course of 3 issues. And after the first installment appeared, Frederica Loss's sons accidentally shot her. And she's on her deathbed, she's ranting and raving, and she said that Mary Rogers had died at her house as a result of a botched abortion. Now, they haven't been able to find the records of this, so we don't know if that's just a rumor that spread, but Poe apparently saw these accounts and said, oh, I've got to change the ending of my story. So he added some details to the next installment. He needed extra time to add these details, so it delayed publication of the next installment for another month while he tried to figure out how to incorporate the new facts into the story. And when you finally get to the very end of the story, the end of the last installment, he's about to reveal the identity of the killer, and there's a note from the editor that says, we don't want to be sued for libel if we get the wrong guy, so we're not going to tell you who did it, but it's pretty obvious from Poe's clues, you can figure it out for yourself. I'm pretty sure Poe had a lot to do with that because he didn't want to be proven wrong. In fact, you can never really prove Poe wrong because he never really revealed the answer. But he was able to claim he had solved the mystery, so by the time you have later reprintings of the story, especially after his death, his editors just assumed he'd identified the killer, that he knew who killed Mary Rogers, even though he never really did. And that's just another one of Poe's hoaxes. This is a guy who convinced New Yorkers that somebody had just crossed the ocean in a hot air balloon. He convinced the world that somebody had mesmerized a man at the moment of death to keep his mind alive after his body was dead. So why couldn't he convince people that he just solved the crime of the century, the murder of Mary Rogers? So if you've ever been wondering where Poe got the inspiration for his stories, just look to the news. And if you want to follow Poe's example and write a great horror or mystery, just watch the news. There's few things more terrifying than the world around us. So thanks for joining us for this week's Curator's Crypt. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. And don't forget to support the Poe Museum at poemuseum.org/support. Well, I may not have found my way out of here yet. At least I'm keeping myself entertained with merchandise from the Poe Museum's online store, which you can reach at poemuseum.org/museum-store.